The next morning, the courtroom was quieter than usual. The same faces filled the benches, but there was a different kind of energy in the air. People had seen something the previous day that surprised them. The man who had been mocked by the judge had handled himself with calm and confidence. Some came back just to see how the rest of it would unfold. The man walked in early again, dressed in the same suit, carrying the same folder. His eyes looked tired but focused. He took his place at the table without saying a word to anyone. The court clerk gave him a polite nod. She had seen hundreds of cases, but something about this one felt different. There was respect now, quiet but real. The judge entered, expression stern as always. But those who knew him well noticed a slight change. He didn't look as smug as he did the day before. Still, his pride wouldn't allow him to admit that he'd been impressed. As he sat down, he looked at the man and said flatly, "Let's continue where we left off, shall we?" The man nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The opposing attorney adjusted her glasses and began her arguments. She spoke quickly, using complex words, throwing out legal terms to remind the court that she was the professional in the room. But the man didn't flinch. He followed every word, jotting notes neatly in his pad. Every few sentences, she'd glance at him, almost waiting for him to trip up. But he didn't, he just listened. When she finished, the judge looked at the man. "Your response, Mr. David?" The man stood slowly, collected his papers, and began to speak. His voice was calm, but it carried a quiet strength that filled the room. He started by addressing the attorney's main points one by one. He didn't interrupt or speak too fast. Instead, he explained why certain claims didn't hold up, backing his words with facts and clauses that were surprisingly precise. The judge leaned forward slightly, pretending to read something on his desk, but he was listening carefully. The man was quoting real case precedents, and he was doing it correctly. The opposing attorney frowned and began flipping through her binder. The spectators in the back row whispered quietly among themselves. It was like watching a story turn upside down. The one everyone thought would lose was standing tall. The judge interrupted halfway through. "Mr. David, where did you get this information? You seem unusually familiar with legal texts." His tone was still sharp, but there was a trace of curiosity now. The man paused. "From books, sir. Prison libraries have more law books than most people think." The room went still. The judge blinked, unsure how to respond. The attorney looked at him, surprised but silent. No one had expected him to say that so openly. The man continued. "I spent a long time there. I read everything I could get my hands on. Criminal law, civil law, property law. It helped me understand how the system works, and how people like me often get lost in it." There was no bitterness in his tone. Just honesty. The judge cleared his throat and straightened his papers. "Well," he said briskly, "let's keep this about the case at hand." But something had shifted again. The arrogance in his voice wasn't quite as strong now. He could tell that the man wasn't just throwing around fancy words. He actually knew what he was talking about. The man continued presenting his evidence. He laid out photographs, documents, and official forms that he had gathered on his own. Each time he explained something, it was clear he had done his homework. The opposing attorney tried to challenge him, but he stayed composed, gently pointing out inconsistencies in her argument without raising his voice. At one point, he referenced a state law about property boundaries. The judge checked his notes, then looked up. "You're quoting subsection 3, correct?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor," the man replied without hesitation, "and if you read the next line, you'll see it supports my position." The judge turned a few pages in the book beside him and read silently. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, though he quickly hid it. He muttered. "You're correct." The gallery erupted in a low murmur. The man didn't smile or gloat. He just nodded and continued speaking as if nothing had happened. The judge tried to maintain control of the room, but his usual sarcasm didn't land the same way anymore. Every time he tried to belittle the man's calm tone disarmed him. It was like trying to shout at a wall that refused to echo back. The balance of power in the room was changing, and everyone could feel it. During the lunch break, the clerk approached the man quietly. "You're doing really well," she said softly. He looked up, surprised by the kindness. "Thank you," he said. "I'm just doing what I can." She hesitated, then added, "You know, he's not used to people standing their ground like that. Most get flustered." The man smiled faintly. "I've been through worse." When the court resumed, the tension was heavier than before. The attorney looked more determined now, ready to regain her footing. She called a witness to the stand, a land surveyor who was supposed to support her client's claim. The man listened carefully, waiting for his turn to question. When the judge allowed him to cross-examine, he stood up with quiet confidence. He didn't try to intimidate or confuse the witness. Instead, he asked simple, clear questions, the kind that slowly revealed small mistakes in the testimony. One by one, the inconsistencies became visible. The witness hesitated. The judge noticed. Even the attorney began to look uneasy. When the questioning ended, the man thanked the witness politely and sat down. There was silence for a moment. The judge looked thoughtful. He wasn't mocking anymore. He was studying him. As the day went on, it became clear that this case wasn't just about property anymore. It had turned into something bigger, a quiet battle for respect. The judge, for all his years on the bench, was realizing that wisdom and learning can come from unexpected places. The man had learned the law not in a classroom, but through hardship, discipline, and a desire to rise above his past. Late in the afternoon, the judge called for a short recess. He stayed seated as the others stepped out. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the papers in front of him. Then he looked up at the man, who was still sitting quietly at his table. "Mr. David," he said after a pause, "why did you decide to represent yourself?" The man looked up. "Because, Your Honor, I couldn't afford a lawyer. And when I asked around, no one wanted to take my case seriously. They looked at my record and decided I wasn't worth their time. So I decided to do it myself." The judge's jaw tightened slightly. "And you think you can do better than trained professionals?" The man shook his head. "No, sir. I don't think that. I just think sometimes the only person who truly fights for you is yourself." The words hung in the air. They weren't said with pride or defiance, just truth. The judge looked down again, pretending to review the files, but his expression had softened. For the first time, he didn't see a criminal. He saw a man who refused to give up on himself. When court resumed, the atmosphere was different. The judge asked questions in a calmer tone. The attorney still argued her case passionately, but the arrogance had faded from the room. The man continued to stand tall, relying on nothing but his preparation and belief that truth could be enough. By the end of the day, even the people in the back row seemed moved. The man had earned their quiet respect. The judge dismissed the court for the day, saying they would reconvene tomorrow for closing statements. As people began to leave, the man packed his papers carefully. The clerk approached again, handing him a note. "That was from the witness," she said softly. "He said you asked fair questions." The man nodded, grateful. When he walked out of the courthouse that evening, the sky was painted with shades of orange and pink. He paused at the steps, taking a deep breath. He had faced another day of judgment, but this time not as a convict or a failure. This time he stood as a man who had earned a measure of respect, even from those who once doubted him. Inside, the judge lingered in his chambers, staring at the case file. His pride wrestled with his conscience. He had mocked the man, but now he couldn't ignore what he had witnessed. Against every expectation, that man had shown knowledge, composure, and integrity. And the judge, for the first time in a long while, began to question his own sense of superiority. The story was far from over, but one thing was clear. Neither of them would walk away from this case unchanged. Part 3 has been completed with a natural emotional flow and realistic human tone, keeping it deeply engaging and completely suitable for YouTube. Would You Like Me to Cheat? Next day began with gray clouds hanging over the courthouse. A light drizzle tapped against the windows, making the morning feel heavy and quiet. Inside, the same crowd gathered again, drawn by curiosity and something more, respect for the man who had stood his ground. People whispered softly as he walked in, carrying his same worn folder, his shoulders steady and his eyes calm. He looked like someone who had spent his whole life fighting battles most people never saw. The judge entered a few minutes later. He didn't carry his usual smirk. He looked thoughtful, even a little tired. He gave a polite nod to the courtroom before sitting down. When his eyes met the man's, there was no hint of mockery this time. Instead, there was something closer to acknowledgement. The clerk called the case again, and the air seemed to still. The opposing attorney adjusted her files, ready for the final stretch. She had underestimated him before, and she wasn't about to make that mistake again. The judge cleared his throat. Mr. David, he said, his voice measured, we'll begin with your closing argument today. Take your time. The man nodded slowly. He stood up, smoothed the wrinkles in his jacket, and looked around the courtroom. His voice, when he began to speak, was calm and genuine, not rehearsed, not dramatic, but real. Your Honor, I know I don't look like the kind of person who usually stands here. I know my past doesn't shine bright. But this case isn't about who I was. It's about what's right now. He paused for a moment, looking down at the papers in front of him. When I first came here, I expected no one to listen. I've lived long enough to know that people like me don't always get a fair chance. But I studied this case because I believed in it. I believed that truth still matters, even for people who have made mistakes. The judge sat quietly, his hands folded in front of him. No one in the courtroom moved. The man went on, laying out his arguments clearly. He explained how the property in question had been mishandled, how paperwork was ignored, and how his rights had been dismissed. He backed every word with evidence, each point tied neatly to the next. There was no anger in his voice, only quiet conviction. As he spoke, the attorney listened closely, taking notes but saying nothing. She had started this trial expecting to crush him. Now she couldn't help but respect the man who stood across from her. When he finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Even the sound of the rain outside seemed to pause. Finally, the judge nodded. Thank you, Mr. David. His tone was sincere this time. The attorney rose next. She delivered her closing statement with professionalism and care. But there was a subtle difference now. She didn't mock him or look down on him. She argued the facts, but did so with respect. When she finished, she nodded politely toward him. A small gesture, but one that meant a lot. The judge leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. He looked between both sides, his eyes lingering on the man a little longer. This court will recess for 1 hour before delivering a decision, he said. As the courtroom emptied for the break, the man stayed behind. He gathered his papers slowly, lost in thought. The clerk approached him quietly, offering him a cup of water. You did well, she said softly. He smiled faintly. Thank you. I just wanted to be heard, she nodded. You were. More than you think. When he stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The sky was still gray, but a faint line of sunlight peeked through the clouds. He stood on the courthouse steps, breathing in the cool air. He thought about how far he had come, from cold, empty prison cells to this moment of standing tall before a judge. He thought of the nights he spent under dim lights reading law books, trying to understand a world that had once felt stacked against him. Now all that work was in the hands of someone who once mocked him. Back inside, the judge sat alone in his chambers. The courtroom was quiet, the sound of rain fading outside. He stared at the case files on his desk, flipping through the pages again. The evidence was solid. The man's reasoning was clear. But what weighed on him more than the papers was the man himself. He had seen arrogance before, he had seen anger and defiance, but this man had shown something else. Humility mixed with strength, patience shaped by pain. The judge leaned back in his chair and sighed. For years he had prided himself on being the smartest person in every room, but now he realized that wisdom didn't always wear a robe. Sometimes it came from experience, the kind that couldn't be taught in law school. When court resumed, the gallery filled again. Everyone sat quietly, waiting for the verdict. The man sat at his table, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the judge. The attorney glanced his way once, offering a small nod. The judge looked out over the courtroom. I've reviewed all the evidence presented, he began slowly. His voice carried a weight that made everyone lean forward. This case was presented clearly and with strong support from both sides. But one side demonstrated a deeper understanding of both the law and the principles of fairness. He looked down at his papers, then up at the man. This court finds in favor of Mr. David. A quiet gasp rippled through the room. The man didn't move right away. It took a few seconds for the words to sink in. Then he exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing. The judge continued speaking. You've presented your case with respect and dignity. You've reminded this court of something important, that justice isn't about appearances or titles. It's about truth. The courtroom stayed silent as the judge set his papers aside. Case closed, he said softly. The sound of the gavel echoed, sharp and final. The man stood there for a moment, then slowly began to pack his papers. The people who had laughed before were now watching him with quiet admiration. Even the attorney walked over and offered her hand. You earned it, she said sincerely. He shook her hand and smiled. "Thank you." The judge remained seated, watching the scene unfold. Something in his chest felt heavy, a mix of pride and regret. When the courtroom finally emptied, he stayed behind. After a few minutes, he called out, "Mr. David." The man turned back, surprised. The judge stepped down from the bench and approached him. For a moment, they stood face to face, two men from very different worlds, yet somehow equal now. The judge spoke quietly. "I owe you an apology. I misjudged you before I even heard you speak. That was wrong." The man nodded slowly. "I've been misjudged most of my life, sir. But hearing that from you, it means a lot." The judge extended his hand. "You've taught me something valuable today." The man shook it firmly. "We all have something to learn, Your Honor." For a brief moment, there was silence between them, not uncomfortable, but respectful. Then the man turned and walked toward the doors. The judge watched him go, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the empty room. Outside, the sky had cleared completely now. The sun broke through the clouds, lighting up the courthouse steps. The man paused for a moment, feeling the warmth on his face. It felt like the first real light he'd seen in a long time. He looked up at the sky and smiled faintly. It wasn't just about winning. It was about redemption, not in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of himself. He had faced a man who once mocked him and earned his respect. And more importantly, he had proven that no one's past defines their worth. As he walked down the street, the people who had once whispered about him now watched in quiet admiration. Some even nodded as he passed. He didn't need applause or praise. The peace he felt inside was enough. Back in his chambers, the judge stood by the window, watching him leave. For the first time in a long while, he smiled, not out of pride but humility. The man he had once mocked had reminded him what justice was truly about, and somewhere deep down, the judge knew he would never forget this case. Because it wasn't just a legal victory, it was a human one. A reminder that strength can come from struggle and that respect must be earned, not demanded. The courtroom was empty again, but the air still carried the weight of what had happened. The man had walked in judged by his past, but walked out defined by his character, and that more than anything was the real verdict of the day. Continue with part 4 next. The courtroom was still and quiet when David stood up again. The papers in his hands no longer trembled. The same people who had been laughing earlier now sat with wide eyes. The judge shifted in his seat, trying to hide his unease. Something had changed in the room. A man everyone had dismissed as an ex-convict was suddenly the one who seemed in control. David took a deep breath and spoke calmly. He walked through each point of his argument with confidence. He quoted laws, explained them in plain words, and pointed out small details in the documents that no one else had noticed. Every sentence he spoke showed that he knew exactly what he was talking about. His voice was steady, not angry or proud, just honest. The sound carried across the room like someone telling the truth after a long silence. The opposing lawyer began to fidget, flipping through his notes. He looked nervous now. The judge asked a few questions, perhaps hoping to trip David up, but David answered each one clearly. He didn't show off and he didn't try to win sympathy. He simply spoke facts. The people in the courtroom leaned forward, realizing this wasn't a man who had come unprepared. This was someone who had studied hard, who had learned through pain and patience. After a while, David paused and looked up. He saw the judge staring at him, the sarcasm gone from his face. For the first time, there was quiet respect in the judge's eyes. David continued, telling the court about how he had found the missing records, how they proved his case, and how no one had cared to check them before. He explained how he had spent nights in the public library after his release, reading books on law because he wanted to understand the system that once broke him. When he mentioned the prison library, the room fell silent again. David didn't go into details about his time there, but everyone could feel the weight behind his words. He said softly, "You can lose everything in life, freedom, family, hope, but if you learn something that helps you stand up again, you haven't lost it all." The judge didn't respond right away. He looked down at his desk, then at the people in the room. David continued presenting his evidence one piece at a time. His hands no longer shook. Every movement was calm and certain. Even the clerk, who had earlier laughed under her breath, now looked down with guilt. As the arguments went on, the truth became clear. The opposing lawyer had relied on weak assumptions and had ignored key records. David had not only found those records but also understood what they meant. He proved that his rights had been violated and that he had been unfairly treated in the past. The judge could no longer deny the strength of his case. David didn't gloat. He simply gathered his papers as if ready to accept whatever came next. The judge finally cleared his throat. His voice, usually loud and sharp, was now quiet. He said, "Mr. David, your presentation was thorough." The courtroom waited. Even the sound of the air conditioner could be heard. "It appears," the judge went on, "that your argument is legally sound. The evidence you've provided leaves no room for doubt." A small murmur spread through the room. The same people who had doubted David were now whispering in disbelief. The judge leaned back and looked at him for a long moment. There was no arrogance left in his expression, only thoughtfulness. David nodded respectfully. He wasn't looking for praise. For him, this was about being heard. He had spent years being judged by people who never asked for his story, and now, for once, his voice mattered. He said quietly, "I only wanted the truth to be seen, Your Honor. That's all I ever wanted." The judge gave a slow nod. Something in his tone softened. He said, "Truth has been seen today." He paused and looked around the courtroom before turning back to David. "It takes courage to come back from where you've been and stand here like this. I see that now." David didn't smile, but there was a calm look in his eyes. He bowed his head slightly in acknowledgement and returned to his seat. The people sitting behind him, strangers a few minutes ago, now watched him with quiet admiration. When the court took a short break, the clerk approached David hesitantly. She said, "I'm sorry for earlier. You really know your stuff." David gave her a polite nod and said, "Thank you. Everyone learns in different ways." His tone wasn't bitter. It was the voice of someone who had already made peace with the world's unfairness. During the recess, the opposing lawyer stepped outside, his face pale. He called someone on his phone, whispering nervously about how things weren't going as planned. Meanwhile, David stood near the hallway window looking out at the city. He thought about how far he had come, from a cell to a courtroom, from being ignored to being listened to. When the session resumed, the judge seemed different. He didn't speak with the same sharp tone. His questions were more respectful, his body language calmer. It was as if he had been reminded that a courtroom was not just a place for judgment, but also for understanding. David presented the final part of his case. He spoke about how many people like him never get a fair chance because they carry a label from the past. He said that people look at us and see what we were, not what we've become. But everyone deserves a chance to start again. His voice didn't tremble, but it carried emotion. Some people in the room wiped away tears quietly. Even the bailiff looked down, his eyes soft. The judge listened closely. There was no trace of mockery now. When David finished, there was silence, a silence filled with respect. The judge took a moment before speaking. He said, "Dear, this court acknowledges the evidence and the integrity shown by the petitioner. The matter will be ruled upon accordingly." It was not an apology, but it was as close as a proud man could come to one. David nodded once more, grateful but not boastful. He gathered his papers carefully, each one a symbol of his journey from doubt to dignity. After the hearing, as people began to leave, the judge remained seated. He seemed lost in thought. The courtroom slowly emptied until only a few people were left. David walked toward the exit when the judge called out softly, "Mr. David." David turned back. The judge stood up, his expression serious but not cold. He said, "You reminded me today that intelligence doesn't come from titles or degrees. It comes from effort, and you clearly put in the work." David replied, "Thank you, Your Honor. Sometimes life teaches better than any school." The judge gave a small, almost shy smile. "Indeed it does," he said. Then he added quietly, "I hope others learn from this too." David gave a respectful nod and left the courtroom. As he walked down the hallway, people glanced at him differently now. He wasn't just a man with a criminal past anymore. He was someone who had earned respect through patience, knowledge, and truth. Outside, the sunlight hit his face, warm and bright. He stood there for a moment, breathing in deeply as if feeling free again. He didn't think about revenge or pride. He only thought about the peace that came from standing up for himself without anger. He had walked into that courtroom being judged, but he walked out being understood. That day, the arrogant judge had learned something he would never forget, that wisdom can come from the most unexpected places. and that sometimes the people we look down on have the most to teach us. The morning was calm, with sunlight streaming into the courthouse, creating long patterns on the polished floor. David walked in quietly, carrying his familiar folder. Today was the day the final decision would be made, and while the previous days had been challenging, he felt prepared. The weight of expectation was heavy, but he had learned to carry it with patience. The judge entered, his expression serious but not arrogant. Something had changed over the past days, and even he could feel it. He wasn't sure how to address it yet, but the mocking tone of the past was gone. Today he would face the truth he had resisted acknowledging before. The courtroom was more crowded than usual. Word had spread about the unusual trial, and people wanted to witness the conclusion. There was quiet chatter as everyone settled into their seats. The opposing attorney looked composed but tense, knowing that this case had taken an unexpected turn. The judge called the court to order. "We will begin with the final statements. Mr. David, you may go first." David stood, placing his folder on the table. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the spectators and the judge, but never with arrogance. His voice was calm, steady, carrying a quiet strength. "Your Honor," he began, "over the past few days I have presented evidence and explained my position. I have done so with respect for the law and for everyone involved. I am not here to boast, and I am not here to speak of my past. I am here because I believe in fairness." He laid out the points of his argument one final time, referencing documents and laws with clarity and precision. Every point he made was tied to factual evidence, and every argument was delivered with patience. The courtroom listened intently, absorbing his words. He continued, "This case is more than property. It is about the principle that everyone deserves a fair chance. People often judge others based on the past, on appearances, or on mistakes they have made. I understand this better than most. I am here to show that with effort, knowledge, and honesty, we can stand for what is right regardless of what others expect from us." David paused, his eyes briefly meeting the judge's. There was no anger, no pleading, only honesty. He continued, "I have learned that patience, discipline, and the willingness to study and understand can overcome many obstacles. I hope that this court and those observing will recognize the importance of truth and fairness in all matters." The judge sat quietly, listening. For the first time, he was not thinking of how to interrupt or belittle. He was simply hearing a man speak with integrity. The opposing attorney tried to counter, but her arguments felt weaker in comparison. She referenced her notes and spoke professionally, but there was no power behind her words. David had established clarity and calm authority. When the statements concluded, the judge took a deep breath. He looked at both sides, his gaze lingering on David. There was a moment of silence before he spoke. "This court has heard all arguments, reviewed all evidence, and considered the integrity and preparation of both parties." He paused, then added, "It is clear that Mr. David has presented his case with a level of understanding, attention to detail, and respect for the law that deserves recognition." The room was quiet, the tension heavy. David did not move. He waited, composed. The judge continued, "Therefore, the court rules in favor of Mr. David. His claims are justified and the evidence supports his position." A soft murmur spread through the courtroom. Some people exchanged surprised looks. Others nodded quietly in respect. David allowed himself a small exhale, relief washing over him. He had been prepared for this, but the moment was still intense. The judge looked directly at him and said, "I must also acknowledge the courage it took to present yourself here with honesty and diligence. You have shown that knowledge and integrity can come from places one might least expect. I apologize for any assumptions I made about your capabilities based on your past." David nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor. I only wish to be heard and to present the truth." The judge gave a small nod, a gesture of genuine respect. The courtroom felt different now. The energy had shifted from skepticism and mockery to recognition and admiration. People who had laughed or whispered about David in the past days now looked at him with newfound respect. The opposing attorney approached him and extended a hand. "You did well," she said sincerely. David shook her hand, acknowledging her professionalism. As the courtroom emptied, David walked slowly toward the exit. Each step felt lighter than the day before. The sun was higher now, brightening the streets outside. People passing by glanced at him, some nodding quietly. He didn't need applause or acknowledgement. He felt an internal peace that had been hard-won through years of struggle, study, and persistence. The judge remained in his chambers, reflecting on the case. He thought about the assumptions he had made, the judgments he had passed, and the lesson he had learned. He had mocked a man who had quietly mastered the law through patience and effort. That man had reminded him that respect and wisdom were earned, not assumed. David stepped outside and looked around at the city, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. It was more than a physical warmth. It felt like freedom, acknowledgement, and closure. He thought of the long nights spent reading and studying, the moments when he had wondered if he would ever have a chance to prove himself. Now, standing in the light, he knew that those efforts had led him here. He walked down the steps slowly, letting the reality sink in. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen for who he was, not defined by what he had been. The courtroom, the judge, even the people who had doubted him, had witnessed his perseverance and his integrity. Inside the courthouse, the judge picked up the case file one more time, reading the final notes and reflecting on the man who had changed his perspective. He realized that lessons often come from unexpected places, and sometimes the most valuable insights are found in humility, persistence, and quiet strength. David moved away from the building, blending into the streets, a man whose past had once seemed like a burden but now felt like a source of strength. He did not boast and he did not seek recognition. He had proven something to himself and to the world around him. That knowledge, patience, and integrity could overcome assumptions, mockery, and unfair judgment. As he walked into the distance, he felt a sense of completion. The legal battle was over, but the impact of what had happened in that courtroom would last far longer. People would remember that a man who was underestimated and mocked had not only defended himself but had also shown others the power of perseverance and honesty. David looked up at the sky one final time before turning the corner. The clouds were gone and the sunlight streamed down without obstruction. In that moment he felt a quiet joy that came not from victory alone, but from having stood tall, spoken the truth, and earned respect on his own terms. And somewhere behind him, in the empty chambers of the courtroom, the judge reflected on the day's events, understanding that his lessons were just as important as David's victory. Both men had changed that day. One learned humility and respect. The other had proven that the past does not define the future. It was a day that would linger in memory for a long time, a story of resilience, integrity, and unexpected wisdom.